In this episode, we bring you the disturbing story of St. Paul police officer Heather Weyker, whose lies led to the wrongful prosecution of dozens of people and put an innocent teenage refugee in jail for 2 years. Will Heather ever be held accountable? I'm Kim Norberg of the nonprofit civil liberties law firm, the Institute for Justice, joined by co-host Keith Neely and IJ attorney Patrick Jaicomo, one of the leaders of our project on immunity and accountability. We're discussing IJ's lawsuit against Officer Weyker, how courts have systematically closed doors to government accountability, and how we are trying to wrench those doors back open. This is Beyond the Brief. Patrick, who is Heather Weyker?
That's a difficult question to answer, but at the top level, Heather Weyker is currently a St. Paul police officer who operates in the larger Minneapolis area. And as of 2024, she's making a six-figure income doing that, despite a long history of doing bad things. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Yeah, so what are some of those bad things?
Well, Heather Weyker, if you search in the court decisions, her name will crop up in a few places. And so a long time ago, a dissent in Minnesota appeals court pointed out the unlikelihood of something that Heather Weyker had alleged. Much more recently, we had a district court in Minnesota grant summary judgment against Heather Weyker for violating the Fourth Amendment by searching a man's apartment without a warrant. But the main thing that Heather Weyker is famous for is beginning in 2008. Heather Weyker, working as a St. Paul officer, concocted a fake sex trafficking ring in the Minneapolis area, and then used witnesses that she coached to expand it to the point where it covered about 30 people. She then took the case to a partner organization in the U.S. Attorney's Office to bring federal charges. The U.S. Attorney told her, no, this is a state case. But she was ultimately able to connect the case to Tennessee by having someone supposedly travel there. And then she got the Tennessee U.S. Attorney's Office to bring this case against 30 people. But as it turned out, the case itself was essentially a fraud. And throughout the case, Heather Weyker was caught lying repeatedly about the ages of her witnesses. Her notes didn't reference anything related to prostitution, but then prostitution would be mentioned in the official reports. She was caught lying on the stand in the district court just over and over and over, so much so that this 30-person sex trafficking ring, which when the story broke was this huge national story that was giving Heather Weyker and the St. Paul Police Department all sorts of plaudits, ultimately crumbled. Of the 30 people, only a handful of them were actually criminally tried, and every single one of them was acquitted. And then the federal government appealed those acquittals because it's very rare for them to lose these cases. And the Sixth Circuit issued a decision where they called out Heather Weyker's repeated dishonesty throughout this case and said that after a painstaking review of the record, they thought that it might be actually a fictitious story. And in any case, they affirmed the acquittal. So 30 people's lives were destroyed through the sex trafficking investigation. Not a single person was actually convicted or found guilty of being involved in sex trafficking. And a federal appeals court called Heather Weyker out for repeatedly lying throughout the process.
So where does IJ come in to all of that?
So where IJ comes in is that along the way, in Heather Weyker's sex trafficking ring fantasy, we have clients who were teenagers at the time. And one of the girls, who was not an IJ client, actually wanted to have a fight with another girl in Minneapolis because these are teenage girls, these are high school girls. They fight over stupid stuff. So one of these girls, Hawa Ahmed, agreed to fight another girl, Muna Abdul Qadir, over something. I can't even tell you what it was. They went to Muna's apartment. It was one of those where like the girls agreed to sort of like take off their earrings and stuff before fighting. They had their silly little fight, which basically started in an elevator and ultimately ended with Muna Abdul Qadir grabbing a knife and attacking the girls and smashing the windshield of their car, which resulted in them calling 911. So at this point, you had three friends, Hawa Ahmed, who fought with Muna, you had Ifra Yassin, and you had Hamdi Mohammed. Now, Hamdi was just sort of pressed up against the wall for all of this. She was by far, like, clearly the most innocent, uninvolved person in this. She was also the youngest. Minneapolis police responded to the scene, treated the three girls as the victims. They were the ones who had called 911. Obviously, they'd been attacked by a knife. The windshield was broken. But little did the three girls know that Muna Abdul Qadir was actually a witness working in Heather Weyker's fabricated sex trafficking case. And so she ran to a neighbor's apartment after the girls called 911 and hid there, where she called Heather Weyker and basically said, "Hey, I'm in big trouble. Can you help me out?" And so Heather Weyker, not wanting to lose her key witness in this fabricated sex trafficking ring, called police officers on the scene by telling them that she was a St. Paul officer. She got put through to the computers in their car, had them actually call her, and said, "No, what actually is happening that I can document and prove is that these three girls knew that Muna Abdul Qadir was a witness in this federal sex trafficking case, and they were seeking her out to intimidate her and keep her from testifying." All of this was false, and provably so. But based on Heather Weyker's assertions, the three girls were arrested. Muna Abdul Qadir was allowed to walk free. And then ultimately, Heather Weyker turned around, doubled down, filed an affidavit against the girls, making the same sorts of false statements. And ultimately, this resulted in Hamdi Mohammed and Hawa Ahmed spending more than 2 years in federal prison waiting for trial, where Hawa Ahmed actually gave birth in a prison full of other people that were either convicted or charged with things like murder. Before the charges against Hamdi were ultimately dismissed, Hawa and Ifra were then taken to trial, where they were both acquitted. And again, people need to understand that at the federal criminal level, something like 99% of cases either result in pleas or convictions. And so here we had Heather Weyker bring effectively 33 different cases, and not a single one of them led to a conviction. In the case of Hamdi Mohammed, the case was dismissed, and her friends who were arrested in the same incident were acquitted at trial by a jury.
This is extraordinary. I mean, Patrick, you've litigated a lot of these cases over the years. Of all the fact patterns that you've seen, is this the most outrageous that you've come across?
Yes. So I was thinking about this, and I think of all the cases I've ever litigated, the worst villain from the government standpoint has to be Heather Weyker. Not just because she was able to destroy so many lives. Dozens of people had their lives turned upside down or completely destroyed because they were arrested. They were charged with crimes that have this horrible reputation-destroying application. And she's gotten away completely scot-free so far. And the other thing that it goes to show is Heather Weyker, by the time all this happened, had been cross-deputized as a federal officer. So she was a St. Paul cop who had limited federal authority to do some things related to this, what became quasi-federal investigation that led to federal charges. And just on her own, without much help from anybody else, she was able to put this thing together and make all these things happen, just because she had the authority of the state of Minnesota on one hand and the authority of the federal government on the other.
Could you talk a little bit about why that distinction matters here? I know that as we've both litigated these sorts of cases quite a bit, we understand that there's a big difference when you're trying to sue a state officer versus a federal officer. How does this all play out when you have someone who's cross-deputized like Heather?
Yeah, so the way that this plays out in practice, unfortunately, is that when someone like Heather Weyker has twice the authority, she actually has half of the accountability. And so when you're trying to sue a state officer, you do it under a federal statute called Section 1983. This is sort of the quintessential civil rights statute in American law. It was one that was passed right after the Civil War. To do that, you have to show someone acted with some state color, and then you have to overcome the doctrine of qualified immunity. So that's a difficult burden in and of itself, but it's much easier than suing someone who acts under color of federal law, because this forces you to litigate either under a doctrine called Bivens, which is an implied cause of action that the Supreme Court has effectively gutted as of 2 years ago, or under the Federal Tort Claims Act. And I know we've talked about this in other cases, but the Federal Tort Claims Act is extremely complicated. It's Byzantine. It's rife with exceptions and pitfalls. And if you don't do it right, it can cancel out your constitutional claims. And so when you have someone like Heather Weyker, who has both state and federal authority, it's sort of this whack-a-mole game where you say, well, she's a state actor, and the government say, no, she's a federal actor and you can't sue her for this reason. Or you say she's a state actor, or that you say she's a federal actor and they say, no, she's a state actor and you can't sue her for that reason. And so that's the game of whack-a-mole that plays out in Hamdi Mohammed and Ifrah Yassin's case.
This is the part that that kind of seems the craziest to me about this case, is the way that different courts have kind of said each version of that thing in this exact same case. So can you kind of walk us through, how did Hamdi's case play out? How did the cases around that play out? Yeah,
so you're right. I mean, this was a hodgepodge because basically what happened was Hamdi and her two friends sued Heather Weyker, and so did about 24 of the people involved in the sex trafficking ring case. And so all these cases got assigned in the District of Minnesota, and they ended up being appealed on different bases. In all of them, Heather Weyker is the defendant, and she's represented by the Department of Justice. So the federal government represents Heather Weyker for some reason. Nobody knows why. She is and was a full-time St. Paul police officer who was paid by St. Paul and still is to this day. And so the way that it played out was a bunch of the people who had sued for the sex trafficking ring issue, their case on appeal was consolidated with Ifrah Yassin's. And there the Eighth Circuit said, there's no Bivens cause of action for the type of thing that happened here. So we're going to throw all those cases out. But as to Ifrah Yassin's case, the only issue on appeal was whether Heather Weyker was entitled to qualified immunity. Because, of course, she had argued, well, there's no case exactly like this one, so it wasn't clearly established such that I had fair notice that what I was doing when lying to these officers on the scene to have these girls arrested was unconstitutional.
I didn't know I could fabricate a 30-person sex ring and use it to destroy people's lives.
Exactly. And we start out with a good result in the Eighth Circuit on that front. Mm-hmm. Because there what the Eighth Circuit said was, no, Heather Weyker, you're not entitled to qualified immunity as to Hamdi, Ifrah, and Hawo, because any reasonable officer would know that lying to another officer to arrest somebody for a sham investigation is illegal. And so that's great. And that's basically verbatim what the Eighth Circuit said. That's good. Set that to the side. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, Hawo and Hamdi Mohammed's cases have been consolidated, and they go up on appeal on the issue of Bivens. Can you sue Heather Weyker as a federal officer? Because all three of the girls sued her for Fourth Amendment violations, both under Bivens for being federal and under Section 1983 for being state. In Hamdi's case, it goes up to the Eighth Circuit on the question of whether Weyker can be sued as a federal officer, and the Eighth Circuit says no. Because this case is not, quote, exactly, and that's the language they use, like the Bivens case itself, there's no cause of action here. So if Heather Weyker is a federal officer, you can't sue her for that. But they add a caveat at the end to soften what is obviously a very harsh and unjust seeming result. Because the way that the panel talks about this throughout is they obviously think Heather Weyker is a villain as well.
Right.
And they say, the framing in the first paragraph is that Hamdi Mohammed is suing this woman who landed her in jail through lies and manipulation. Okay, so that sounds great. By the end of the case, they're saying, actually, you can't sue her, but we're going to remand this case back down. And if the district court finds that Heather Weyker acted under color of state law, then you can sue under Section 1983. So this is a sort of grain of hope.
Let's pause for a second because two things are going on here. Well, three things are going on here. But let's talk first about Bivens. I know that we've talked about Bivens on this show before with you, but can you give us a really quick rundown of what that is? What does that mean?
Yeah, Bivens means that you're allowed to sue federal officers for violating the Constitution. And the underlying rationale for that is a Supreme Court case from 1971 called Bivens versus 6 unknown named agents of Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is a mouthful. And there, essentially, the Supreme Court formalized this process by saying, even though there's not a statute that gives someone a cause of action to sue a federal officer for violating the Constitution itself implies by saying you have these rights that if a federal officer violates these rights, the officer can be held accountable for damages in a federal court case. In the intervening 50 years, however, the Supreme Court sort of turned its back on Bivens to the point of almost overruling it, but not quite. And so the door for Bivens is almost closed all the way, but there might be a tiny sliver of it left open. And so it's very difficult to sue a federal officer under Bivens unless your case is identical to one of the three that were identified between 1971 and 1980. And really how that plays out is kind of the same way that the clearly established test for qualified immunity plays out, which is to say, if you get a friendly court the court can squint and say, yeah, this looks close enough to Bivens. If you get an unfriendly court, they will be able to split whatever hairs are necessary. And we've seen this over and over in IJ cases like Jose Oliva's case and like Kevin Bird's case and, of course, in Hamdi Mohammed's case.
And then you're talking about how these different cases were consolidated. What does that mean? And why did they get sort of fractured into the Hamdi group and the IFRA group?
Yeah, so courts basically have the administrative power to put cases together that are similar or to break them apart. And so here, for various reasons related to timing and ease of addressing certain issues, the courts put together IFRA's case and all those other cases on the one hand, and then they put together Hawo and Hamdi's cases on the other. It's just happenstance. So is the reason why the issue in IFRA's case was qualified immunity, whereas the issue in Hamdi and Hawo's case turned out to be Bivens on appeal. None of these things were sort of strategic decisions necessarily. They just were a matter of timing and a matter of the way that the court wanted to hear the cases and then how it decided the cases.
Did you know IJ represents ordinary people, free of charge, as they fight back against government abuse? If you're looking for a rewarding way to support our work, consider becoming a member of our merry band of monthly donors and stand shoulder to shoulder with IJ's clients every month of the year. Monthly donations are convenient and cost-efficient, meaning more of your money goes directly to our fight for freedom and justice. Sign up to donate today at ij.org/monthly.
So in IFRA's case, they say, yes, she was acting in sort of a state capacity and she can be sued in that capacity, right? And then in Hamdi's case, they say she's not federal, you can't sue her under federal, but maybe you can under state. Like, that part seems consistent enough, right?
So no, actually, in IFRA's first appeal, they don't address this issue of whether she can be sued yet, because they're talking just about qualified immunity. And all they say there is qualified immunity doesn't apply. So the district court can decide now whether you can sue her as a state officer or a federal officer. Then we have Hamdi's case, which comes up and they say you can't sue her as a federal officer. Now, IFRA's case comes up, and this time, so this is the third appeal involving Heather Weyker. This time, the court is now finally addressing this question of whether you can sue her as a state officer. And there they look through the facts as alleged by IFRA, and they say, okay, well, there's some state stuff here, but basically it's just window dressing and it's not good enough. And so they ultimately use the statement that state law had nothing to do with Heather Weyker's actions here, and therefore Ifrah Yassin's case cannot proceed under Section 1983, and that's the end of her case because that was the way that she appealed that case. We got involved, IJ did at that point, and filed a cert petition with the Supreme Court that was ultimately denied. We also then filed a cert petition in Hamdi's case about the federal thing. So we're trying to get the court to address what do we do with these state task force officers because the courts are in an open split over what to do about it. And what has generally been treated as the default is that if somebody gets deputized as a federal officer, it's sort of this Midas touch, you know, if you look at it that way, or maybe it's just a drop of poison on the other. But either way, that's sort of the lazy way out in many of these cases. And we'll talk about this in a bit, but state federal task forces were also at issue in the King case. And there, they said, if you're on a state federal task force, we're treating you federal, and dropped a footnote and said, but it doesn't really matter because 1983 or Bivens are basically the same, blah, blah, blah. In the intervening years, we now know that they're not the same because it's much harder to sue federal officers. And that's why in Hamdi's case, the Eighth Circuit, as opposed to the Sixth in King, has said, you actually can't sue this person as a federal officer. And so the only thing you could do, maybe, is sue under 1983. Now, in Ifrah's case, the Eighth Circuit says, no, you can't do that. And so that's where we come back. This whole long story comes back to this question because in Hamdi's case, when we filed cert to say there should be a Bivens cause of action here, we should be able to sue her as a Fed, the Solicitor General of the United States actually responded, which they don't often do unless they think there's some merit to the case, and said, Supreme Court, you shouldn't take this case yet because, as you can see in the Eighth Circuit's decision, Hamdi Mohammed might have a 1983 case. You might be able to sue Heather Weyker as a state officer. And so it's premature to take the case on Bivens. Let's see how that plays out. And ultimately, the Supreme Court went ahead and denied cert in that case. And so we said, IJ, all right, we will climb the mountain again. If that's all we need to do to get everything in one place, we will do it. And when we made that decision, we actually thought that Ifra's case would be controlling in Hamdi's because we didn't, but then would soon discover new evidence that would make it clear that what Heather Weyker was doing was acting under color of state law.
Well, and it was the same judge even, right? And so this thing comes up in our cases where we're saying, okay, there's these task forces. Are they state? Are they federal? Different courts say different stuff about this. But here we have one court and one specific judge in that court looking at these two cases that are identical. It's the exact same story that's happening here. They have the same claims. They have the same everything. In one case, he says, this is definitely not federal, but maybe you could do it under state. And then in the other case, he says, oh, this is definitely not state either. And it can't even be that, he didn't know. He was looking at these two cases kind of separately because it's the exact same situation. Like, how as one judge do you even get there?
You'd have to ask the judge.
Sure.
I will say it is just as egregious as you indicate, because in the case where the Eighth Circuit says you might be able to proceed under Section 1983, there's a dissent from Judge Kelly, and Judge Kelly says this is basically providing false hope because as we write this now, we know that the district court in Ifra Yassin's case has said that she cannot sue Heather Weyker under Section 1983 either. Now, of course, that's not dispositive for the Eighth Circuit, but it's a pretty strong indication that this issue is coming. And so the Eighth Circuit, although it's saying, well, maybe you can do it that way, should have been a little more circumspect. And in fact, the way that the decision in Hamdi's case frames it is to say, don't worry, it's not over yet. There might be this other avenue. And so it's not even just kind of like throwing it out there as a possibility. It's not saying that there is, but it's obviously trying to ameliorate what seems like an unjust result by saying, but maybe you can do it the other way. And I want to pause here and say this is something we see all the time in our immunities work because every case ultimately gets decided on a single issue or maybe a couple issues. And oftentimes we will see courts decide that issue in a way that seems extremely draconian and unfair. And commonly they will say, well, I know this seems really unfair, but it's possible that the plaintiff could have done things differently or these lawyers could have argued it differently. I don't know. But if they had, maybe this case would proceed. And what we know, because we work on all these issues, is that's just not true. And that's either a lie that the court is telling itself or one that is telling people so that they don't see the injustice of the outcome as a true injustice, but rather maybe as some mistake that the plaintiffs or their lawyers made in the case.
Yeah, there's always some other less traveled path that you should have chosen earlier in the case.
Right.
And courts will happily tell you, oh, in this case you picked A, you should have picked B. And then when the next case comes along, you picked B, you probably should have picked A. It's, as a lawyer litigating these cases, Patrick, how frustrating is that as someone who spends so much time carefully crafting arguments, preparing for the big day, only to get, a judge that just kind of feels like they're not engaged with the arguments that you're making?
Very. It's very frustrating. And it's even worse than that because we've been in the situation where it was A, you should have picked B, B, you should have picked A. Or we say, okay, here's A and B.
Right.
And they say, oh, because you brought A and B, they cancel each other out. And that was what's happened in the King case so far.
Can you talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah. So in James King's case, he had something very similar happen to him, not with all of the manipulation and lies in the same way that Hamdi's case did, but he was also arrested by these state federal task force officers in Michigan. So he was arrested by an FBI agent and a Grand Rapids police detective. And they were similarly working on one of these task forces. And so when James King sued, he sued the same way that Hamdi had under both 1983 and Bivens, but James also included a Federal Tort Claims Act case. Claim, and that's the case. That's the sort of claim that we brought in the in Trina Martin's case and just won at the U.S. Supreme Court. And there, you had to deal with qualified immunity, and you had to deal with color of state law. And like I said earlier, the Sixth Circuit, which ultimately said these officers don't get qualified immunity, but you have to sue them as feds under Bivens instead of under Section 1983. Drop a footnote saying, but it doesn't matter. That case then ultimately gets kicked out of court because the government says, aha, but since you had the FTCA claim in the same case as the constitutional claims and you lost the FTCA claim, it cancels out the constitutional claims. The Supreme Court decided one issue of that, but the effect has been the Sixth Circuit's rulings after that have allowed the cancellation to occur. And so it really is this impossible game, which seems more and more like it's just meant to provide a facade of some sort of potential accountability, and that no matter which of the three doors you pick in the game show, they all have a brick wall on the other side. And so it's very frustrating, of course, for us, but it's more frustrating for people like Hamdi Mohammed and James King. I mean, James King and Hamdi Mohammed could not have come from more different backgrounds. But James King grew up in this very rural area of Michigan, kind of thinking about American police as the authorities and they're people you can trust. And, he was one of those just very standard, American-born type guys who trusted the police and then had this happen to him only to learn over 10 years of litigation. Actually, this is kind of just a promise that we make to ourselves that's not real. And you have, on the other hand, Hamdi Mohammed, who's a refugee from Somalia, growing up, under very difficult circumstances in the Minneapolis area. And she makes the same discovery, despite being someone who's come to this country thinking, oh, well, this is America. The government doesn't get to run roughshod over you in the way that it may have in Somalia, and finds out in the same process a decade of litigation that actually, no, that's a false hope. And our hope in both of those cases, which are still ongoing, is to make sure that that isn't a false hope. It's just that so far it has been. And what we're trying to do with these cases, in addition to winning for these folks, is show, look, they're pretending there's three doors and you just have to go through the correct door. But in reality, we know that those doors are all bricked up.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, specifically about Hamdi's case. You mentioned when her case went back down and I guess some discovery was done, you guys found out more information that made it crystal clear that she was acting as a state officer. Could you tell us a little bit about what you guys discovered?
Yeah, so this was actually the most surprising thing from my perspective, because like I said earlier, we figured when we had to go back down and climb the mountain again after what the Solicitor General had said, we're just going to go down and we're going to say this case is bound by Yasin because the facts are basically the same as alleged, and then we would go back up and file another cert petition. But in the intervening time, I started digging into the issues more. No discovery has been done in any of these Weyker cases, meaning none of the plaintiffs have gotten the government to give them documents. They've not been able to sit down and ask Heather Weyker questions. No one's been questioned about why was Heather Weyker cross-deputized, who was in charge of all this stuff, whatever. That's all just a mystery. And so the government has essentially been able to, contrary to the standards of review, get the courts to basically view the things through their own lens, which is obviously very beneficial to them. But before we started the mountain climb again, I dug into this stuff from all the things that we had learned in King. I knew what sort of documents might be floating around out there. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, we actually found a trove of documents that showed very clearly that what Heather Weyker was doing was acting as a St. Paul police officer first and foremost, not as a federal officer first and foremost, but as a St. Paul officer. And so the key documents that we found once the case came back down, and we did this without any discovery. This was just our own sleuthing.
I didn't realize that. That's incredible.
Yeah. And we got really lucky to find these things because it's a long story and it's not very interesting. But the documents themselves are one of those very few moments you have as a lawyer where you say like, oh my goodness, we did it. Like we found the magic key or whatever it is.
The smoking gun.
We found the smoking gun. We thought we did. Mm-hmm. And so here the smoking gun came in the form of three things that are called memorandum of understanding. And so this is basically a contract that several agencies might enter into to create a task force. And that lays out like who's in charge and who does what and who pays for what, all these sort of details. And so the first memorandum of understanding that we found, and the most consequential here, was one that established, we learned, the task force that Heather Weyker was working on all these years. And it's called the Gerald D. Vick Task Force of Minnesota. So it's already sounding very much like state color. Mm-hmm. And this is just in the first paragraph. You read in further and it says, the St. Paul Police Department is the lead agency in establishing and operating this task force. And so I see that and I just think, bingo, right. This is it. We keep digging. And now now that we've found this piece, we can put together other documents that we did have. For instance, the affidavit in support of the charges against Hamdi that Heather Weyker signed says, I'm Heather Weyker. I'm a task force officer / SPPD officer. I was assigned by the Vice Unit to work as part of this federally funded HTTF, Human Trafficking Task Force. But now we know, because we have the Gerald D. Vick Task Force, which calls itself an HTTF, that that's what she was referring to. And so this whole time, she starts this investigation as only a St. Paul officer working on a St. Paul-led task force. She meets Muna Abdul Qadir, the witness that attacked the girls, as only a St. Paul cop. She's filing St. Paul police reports. She goes to eventually the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office, and they say, no, we're not going to prosecute this because it's a state case. And eventually, there gets to be such dimension that other federal reinforcements come in to support Heather Weyker's state investigation. But she's never actually put in charge or put under the charge of federal officers. She is eventually cross-deputized with a very small amount of authority, which is just to seek and execute warrants, which is not what's happening when she's doing this stuff to any of these people, but certainly not to Hamdi Mohammed. And so now we've put together all these pieces. It is compelling that this was mostly, if not almost completely, a state operation meant to serve the purposes of the state of Minnesota and the St. Paul Police Department. On top of that, we found 2 other memoranda of understanding between St. Paul and the federal government for other task forces. And again, we don't have discovery, so we can't confirm that there aren't way more of these or that there might not be one for this particular situation that we're not aware of. The government's attorneys have said that that's not the case. But both of these documents specifically call out that cross-deputized officers like Heather Weyker act under Section 1983 liability as opposed to Bivens. It's a paragraph that says federal officers are liable for constitutional violations under Bivens. State officers and cross-deputized officers are liable under Section 1983.
And it just explicitly says that.
It just says that.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. And so we have the Gerald D. Vick Task Force for Heather Weyker's task force saying this is a St. Paul task force. We have these others where St. Paul and the federal government have obviously this custom of treating cross-deputized officers as those acting under Section 1983 and therefore liable under color of state law, which was not what happened in Ifrah Yassin's case. And we think jackpot, right? We found other good stuff too. I won't go through every bit of it, but we found a ton. And so we go back in and we provide all these documents and we say we want to amend the complaint. The government moves to dismiss and the district court just says, yeah, this is just Ifrah Yassin's case again, and dismisses it. So we appeal to the 8th Circuit, again, say like, look at all this stuff. Again, the legal question is there any state color? Not is there primary state color or is there any federal color? Is there any state? It's not the absence of federal or the absence of anything else. It's just state. There's just no way to look at all this stuff and say there was no state color here. But the 8th Circuit, in its recent decision, actually says no. It doubles down on the statement from Ifrah's case, and it says state law had nothing to do with, that's a quote, nothing to do with what Heather Weyker did here. And so that's where we are right now. And it's just galling because that just can't be true. Even if you subscribe to some sort of mostly federal thing, we have provided enough evidence that there should at least be discovery into this question, but it shouldn't be mostly federal. 1983 operates under any state color. And so if you look at the bowl of punch and you say, is that a bowl of punch? And you say, sure, it is, but I've put a few drops of poison in there. And the question is it poison or is it punch? Well, I'm not drinking the punch. There's some poison in there, right? And so we have the hook for 1983 here. Right. There is state color. Even if you ultimately determine that there was more federal color, because ultimately this resulted in a federal charge that was dismissed. It also resulted in a state charge, by the way. But the point is, what we need courts to do is engage seriously with this issue. And the problem is, so much of what little case law is out there exists from an era where it didn't matter, like King said, if you were coming under 1983 or Bivens, because you could sue either way. Now it is the most consequential question, because if it's federal, you're almost always going to be kicked out of court on the lack of cause of action under Bivens.
Well, and it makes me wonder, under the 8th Circuit's most recent opinion, what would it take for Heather Weyker to have been acting under color of state law? You have an agreement that says this is a state-led task force. She at all times presents herself as a state law enforcement officer. She acts at all times as a state law enforcement officer. Did she have to paint "I'm a state officer" on her forehead? I mean, what more did she have to do in order to qualify as an actor under state law?
I can't say, because she effectively did paint that on her forehead. I mean, she calls in to intervene in this process and says, Heather Weyker out of St. Paul, badge number, whatever, wants you to call her. And then she introduces herself. Hey, I'm a St. Paul officer on assignment with the FBI. Then she says in her St. Paul police report, here are the lies. Then she flips that into an affidavit and says, I'm a St. Paul police officer working on this HTTF, which turns out to be the Gerald Vick Task Force. Every single bit of this is suffused with state color. Without state color, none of this happens. At least it doesn't happen at the hands of Heather Weyker. And then we're talking about a completely different scenario.
Why is the DOJ involved in this? Like, why are they the ones that are defending Heather?
This is a great question. I mean, obviously the answer is because they're taking the position that federal officers deserve no accountability, and they're extending that to protect their sort of partners in these task forces. So presumably it will be more attractive for state and local officers to join these task forces. But it's not clear to me when and why the DOJ decides which cases to represent. We've had kind of a 50-50 split when we bring cases against federal officers where the DOJ represents them or they get private counsel paid for by the federal government. I have no idea why DOJ would lay out what have to be at this point millions of dollars in attorney time and effort to defend Heather Weyker in 26 or whatever it is lawsuits. But they have chosen to do that, and they've done it very zealously throughout this whole process. And I think what it indicates is what we should all be concerned about, which is this growing trend of state federal task forces that has sort of metastasized across the United States over the last 50 years with very little notice. And so you have this idea of state federal formal task forces starting in about the late 1970s with terrorism task forces that are limited to big cities like New York. But what people don't realize is quietly over the last 50 years, task forces have started popping up everywhere and covering all sorts of different things. And so you can look at a city like Pittsburgh, and it has advertised on its U.S. Attorney website 7 task forces in the Pittsburgh metro area. We're talking about a case with James King, which is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Federal task forces are in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Obviously, Hamdi Mohammed here in Minneapolis. These task forces now extend across the country. We don't have comprehensive data on how many there are, but there's no doubt that there are more than 1,000 of these task forces based on what I have seen, and that the task forces usually have 1, 2, 3 federal officers and then 10 times as many state and local officers. And what this does is it does 2 things. It allows, 1, a force multiplier effect with state and local officers and federal officers. But 2, it then allows the federal government to essentially act as local police. And so we saw that in James King's case, where they were trying to execute a state law warrant for a state law crime against a state law suspect, and that's how they came across James King. Why is the federal government involved in this? Grand Rapids is nowhere near the border of another state, so you can't argue that there's some concern about flight to another state. Hamdi Mohammed's a similar situation. Like, what is going on here? This is just basically big government run amok now. And the other thing that we have discovered and have articulated to many local officials who have been outraged by these cases or others is once you give this or allow this cross-deputization to happen, not only does that mean that I can't sue these folks as a plaintiff's attorney, but it often means that you can't hold them accountable criminally if they do something terrible, because state laws are not allowed to criminally bind federal officers who are doing their job. And so this really is this sort of crazy area now that's been carved out and made bigger and bigger and bigger, where these folks are unfortunately treated like federal officers who are allowed to operate in the Constitution-free zone.
You know, I know you have a good question. I don't know what it is, but I assume it's fantastic.
Your question is better.
I don't know, but speaking of the outrage, I am personally outraged that Heather Weyker is still employed. I'm shocked that the outrage surrounding her case has not led to some sort of formal punishment. I can imagine IJ would fire me in a heartbeat if a panel of Sixth Circuit judges said Mr. Neely lied to us, as I'm sure any person
I bet just one judge saying that would probably do it.
If even one judge said that, I'd be done. How on earth is Heather Weyker still employed as a Minneapolis Police Department
IJ has higher
officer?
Standards than Minnesota?
Well, I mean, that's a given, but I don't understand how this person can still be employed.
I don't have an answer. I mean, this is one of those things where after it all broke, the St. Paul police opened an investigation, and then they said, we can't comment on this because we have an open investigation, which remained open for, I think, something like a decade before they quietly closed the investigation and did nothing. As far as I can tell, there have been no repercussions for Heather Weyker professionally. That's how she got to the point of raiding that guy's house without a warrant. She was just a St. Paul cop at that point. And that was years and years after all this happened. And so what we do know is that, she's still a higher ranking officer with the St. Paul Police Department. She still makes a 6-figure salary. And she's repeatedly, since these incidents, violated other people's constitutional rights. And seemingly nothing is going to be done about it. And I don't know why. I don't see what sort of special benefit that her employment provides the St. Paul Police Department at this point. But that's sort of beside what I'm working on here. And I'm just trying to get a remedy for my client.
How does this explosion in task forces interact with, we're right outside of the DC area. There's all this stuff about how the, federal government has taken over the DC police or something. How does this interact with that at all?
So yes, it does, in the sense that the Section 1983 liability also allows for you to bring claims for violations under DC law. But I think the bigger picture way that it interacts with the current system, as we've seen many, many times over, you see state officers being cross-deputized for some reason or another. This happened with all the Antifa riot stuff out in Portland. It's happened repeatedly with almost whole police departments, like in Jacksonville, like half the police department was cross-deputized. Atlanta had a large cross-deputization program that they ultimately withdrew from because the federal government would not allow police to wear body cams if they were cross-deputized. And as we see this sort of expansion of federal policing that we do see with the ongoing efforts to hire more federal police, we're going to see more and more partnerships with this. Of course, in the immigration context, we've seen this with all of the cooperative agreements that, for instance, the state of Florida has entered into. But we're seeing this in all sorts of other areas that have nothing to do with immigration. We're seeing this with, for instance, ATF raids that are supported by local officers. We're seeing this with drug raids that are supported by local officers. We're seeing this with raids for any other number of reasons, where anytime the FBI or the DEA or the ATF wants to do something, it will either involve local police or it'll just ask the local police to do them itself. I mean, the case that we had for Karen Jimerson, which was a wrong house raid case in Texas, was conducted completely by local Texas police, but done at the behest of the DEA. And so we start to see these things manifest in every possible way. And the thing that should concern all of us, regardless of how we might feel about any one of these issues, is what is effectively happening here is we are becoming a nation that has a federalized police force on the one hand. And on the other hand, once the police force has been federalized, there's basically almost nothing that can be done about it outside of the Federal Tort Claims Act, which has all sorts of limitations that we've talked about in other videos. And so we are running headlong into a disastrous situation that the founders would have found completely unacceptable.
To wrap up, what you just described is all very bad. Why should we be optimistic?
So we should be optimistic about these things because, as I've said several times today, a lot of the case law was created in this space under, frankly, sloppy analysis that was done because it didn't really matter at the time. And I am hopeful that now that it does matter, and now that the Supreme Court has taken this approach about the text of the statutes creating causes of action and things like that, that it's impossible to look at a situation like the Heather Weyker situation with Hamdi Mohammed or the Todd Allen situation with James King and say, oh, actually, these guys were not acting under any state color. And if they are acting under any state color, the court needs to take more seriously the fact that Congress did provide a cause of action there. And so if you're going to take away Bivens because Congress didn't act, you need to provide Section 1983 in a way that honors the clear language of that statute in the same way that we have argued in the Martin case. You need to also provide the cause of action that Congress has allowed for in the Federal Tort Claims Act. And so the reason that I'm optimistic is discussing things like the language and original public meaning of Section 1983 and the language and original public meaning of the Federal Tort Claims Act very clearly supports the ability to bring causes of action. And the reason why I think those things have sort of withered on the vine over the past several decades is because you had all of these things being funneled into Bivens. And so now that Bivens has been largely cut off, it's impossible for, at least in a principled way, the courts to then turn around and look at the language, look at the first principles for the FTCA in Section 1983 and say, no, actually, we are going to ignore the language of Congress when it gives positive rights to people, but we're going to very strongly assume that Congress wouldn't want us to give positive rights unless it has said so.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for coming in and talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. I know it's complicated, but the stuff is worth knowing, I promise.
It is.
Well, and thanks to all of you for listening. And if you'd like to get more of our videos, you can like and subscribe to our channel. And if you'd like to support this work, you can join us with it just $5 a month at ij.org/monthly. Thank you.
Thanks again for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and tune in for more videos.